No spoilies! No spoilies!
Boring video games are the worst type to try and talk about, more so than bad games I find, because a shit game is often infuriating or annoying enough that I have enough spite to at least try and get a decent way in before setting fire to the television. They elicit an actual emotional response, and I'll at least remember them for a few weeks after I'm done playing them, if only because nailing their disc to the wall out of pettiness will keep them in my field of vision for longer. They also make for great target practice. Boring games though don't even have that to offer. When you top out at mid and never really drop below it, I'm more likely to abandon ship if I get stuck, because I don't have that investment to proceed further, nor do I feel the bewilderment at the terribleness because the game can't even achieve bad, and that's impressive. The fact that I'm calling the game Morbid Boreds of Meh in the title of this script is probably all I really need to say, but I would like to dissect the game a bit further and discuss the good ideas it had to be as fair as possible. So let's look at this confusing Demon Souls wannabe and figure out what it does right, where it falls short, and how, when all is said and done, we're left with one of the most forgettable experiences I've ever had in gaming since... well, I genuinely can't remember what was my last most forgettable gaming experience, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. So, Morbid Lords of Meh, what's going on with this mess? Morbid Lords of Meh is a Souls-like, and Titan fuck am I so sick of laying out what that is at this point. I'm just going to assume that you already know, but in case you don't, if there's that 1 in a million chance that you somehow don't know, I'll throw a description on the screen or something. I just don't want to say it out loud again. The alternative plan was to read it in Goofy's voice, but that just led to me quoting a Goofy movie over and over again, and I forgot while my recording software was open, so we're not going to be doing that. You probably know that this subgenre is one that I love, and if you saw my last review of Another Crab's Treasure, you'll know that I love the game so much that I called it my new favourite Souls-like, and that wasn't an exaggeration or anything. I mean it, 100%. It took the Souls-like formula, and whilst I did jokingly call it Crab Souls for the entire review, it does actually have enough of its own identity for its art style, story, and mechanics that it isn't just a knockoff, it's its own game. It uses a foundation well whilst remembering to do its own thing. Morbid didn't quite nail this. It basically took a look at Demon Souls, then seemingly hired those Simpsons writers to create legally distinct versions of everything, even though we know exactly what all of these things are supposed to be, they're just distinct enough that the lawyers can't jump at it. I almost respect this level of blatancy, but let's be fair here, Morbid isn't just Demon Souls but called something different, it's just very similar to that sort of situation. The game feels ripped right from the early PS3 era, and I don't mean that in a cool retro way, I mean that in a more of, hey, this technology is new and we don't entirely know how we're supposed to work with it yet sort of way. It feels a bit inelegant and janky, but let's look at why. First of all, the combat. It is the backbone of the game after all. It makes use of a stamina bar, which feels like it drains way too fast regardless of what weapon I'm wielding, though if you do stagger an enemy then perform a critical hit, your stamina bar will completely refill. All enemies have a visible stagger meter that is represented by the little segmented bar below their health bar, and to the game's absolute credit, you can't really ignore this system if you want to make real headway. Now, some enemies are weak enough that you don't need to worry about this at all, you can just kill them with basic attacks, but most enemies have an annoying amount of health, and most areas only have like 3 or 4 unique enemies for you to encounter at all, and a lot of them are not the easily dispatched ones. You have to take your time and whittle down their health bit by bit. You can perform attacks with the right shoulder button and trigger. R1 is your basic attack that deals more direct damage, but R2 deals far more staggered damage, and with enough of these hits done, the enemy falls over and you can land one of those critical hits. It's also a good idea to carry 2 weapons with you at any given time. One is your primary damage dealer stroke stun bar filler, and the second weapon for actually performing the critical hits themselves. I made use of this big ass axe for the majority of the game. It had a decent range and respectable power, but then, once I found this rot sword thingy-majig, I kept it handy because when you perform a critical hit with this weapon, it attacks 3 times for a huge amount of damage, whereas the big axe I was using only attacks once for considerably less damage. So you'll have to be conscious of how each weapon works to better suit you and the situations that you're in. Also, I made use of this big ass axe because the starting sword that we get looks like this, and in a medieval dark fantasy world, this Final Fantasy looking sword really just doesn't fit the vibe. Yes, this does matter, by the way. Consistency is really important in a piece of creative media. If you have random objects that look like they were pulled straight out of other sources, then you risk compromising the consistency and it just gets distracting. I had to keep this sword unequipped because it just really bothered me. It looks like Cloud's Buster Sword thingy, just a little bit smaller. I'm gonna be real, I don't know if I love the need to swap between different weapons just to exploit the critical. obstacles. On the one hand, it's kind of a neat level of planning on the player's part that rewards their diligence and preparations, but on the other hand, I think a big fuck off axe should do a decent amount of critical hit damage. By the way, I am not at all saying that I dislike weapons that do better in certain situations, because sure, that's absolutely how weapons work. I'm completely okay with that. It's just, if I've already knocked you to your arse with my giant mother-sucking axe, then said axe should be enough to end you, not just lightly tickle you. Most enemies have an irritating amount of health and can feel like an utter chore to do battle with, especially in the numerous arenas where we're locked into a small space with several foes and need to kill all of them to proceed. Ah, the Life Force door, the second dumbest security system after the anti-burglar breadstick. I get that this was a thing for games for a while, but if we could all avoid being so lazy as to wholesale duplicate the silliest design choices from the last few generations, then that would just be super. Most enemies have two types of attacks, normal ones that you can block and parry with your weapon at just the right time, and heavy attacks that you'll either need to avoid entirely or just shoot at with your magical gun. I would liken it to Bloodborne, but the comparison is very surface level. The gun reloads automatically when you kill an enemy, though you can use items to reload it if you absolutely need to, and it's not upgradable in any way, shape or form. I don't love the gun, but I can't really fault it. I just don't like it that much, and I wouldn't mind if the game ditched it and just had certain attacks that we need to avoid. If you do shoot an enemy at just the right moment, and you do a significant amount of staggered damage to them, but the actual damage of the projectile itself is annoyingly low, so unless you do this, the gun just isn't all that great. On the subject of weaponry, the game does have a rather impressive selection of weapons for you to pick from, and whilst you can't really upgrade them in the traditional sense, you can customize them. You'll pick up these runes as you explore each of the worlds, and each weapon has a number of slots that you can put the runes into. Most runes have a positive and negative effect, but if you take them to Faceless McNoleg over here, he'll infuse them into your weapons. In this event, 20% of the positive effects and 10% of the negative effects now remain, but you can use the slots again. It's not a bad system. It does mean that we have to be more considerate with our rune choices, and we have to do a bit of planning around it, but it's a lot like the gun in that I can't fault it per se. It's just not really a system that I like that much. Leveling up in this game is very different to what you might expect. You don't really have levels as much as you have skill points. Every time you fill this experience bar up at the top, you get a new skill point that you can use to upgrade these blessings, which serve as perks to improve your abilities. But the price is incredibly steep, so guess what? If you want to buff all of these as much as you can, you're going to be grinding so much that even a BDSM club would tell you to calm the fuck down. I didn't bother because the game is balanced in such a way that the free blessings I found in the 6 hours I could be asked to play the game for carried me well enough. I upgraded the stamina one once and then neither of the other two, and I was fine. Most enemies are very readable with predictable patterns, and checkpoints are almost overly common, so I doubt a veteran of Souls-likes would struggle. This is again to the game's absolute credit, but I usually died in combat because I misread an enemy or I made a mistake. Even in the rooms where multiple enemies spawn in, it's not overly hard to stay alive, and if you die, it's usually because you made an error. It very easily could be seen as a cheap way of killing a player, but actually playing the game, it doesn't really feel like that, at least not to me. For these rooms, a good tactic is to keep moving and favour stagger attacks over damage. Keep at least one ranged enemy alive if there are ranged enemies present, because they can deal damage to melee enemies, and as soon as you see any enemy anywhere stagger, run up to it and go for the critical, because you'll be safe whilst performing the critical hit and you'll immediately recover all stamina. It's not amazing game design, but it is functional, and the game usually uses all of its admittedly limited tools to the very best of its abilities. Onto the subject of checkpoints, they take the form of these shrines which you can rest at to recover your health and healing items, but doing so respawns the enemies, fairly standard for the Souls-like. However, you don't rest by default, so you can just visit them to level up your blessings without respawning all the bad guys, which I think is a fairly nice touch. But if you do want to heal and get your items back, then you need to select Meditate, which throws up this loading screen. It's kind of a janky feeling, the same with dying. Once you die, you have to manually select Rise Anew, and then you have to press again once the loading screen is done, and it's a small issue at best, but it makes dying feel slightly more tedious than it otherwise would. If you are a game dev, please never underestimate just how much impact even the smallest design choice can make. There's nothing conceptually annoying about pressing a button to revive yourself or to move on from a loading screen, but these are both an extra step between me dying and me getting up for another go. It's such a small issue that on its own it doesn't matter, but as part of a larger whole it feels a bit unnecessary, and it's distracting enough that I at least felt the need to mention it here. Dying at most takes like 6 seconds, that's from the time that you drop to the time that you respawn, but those extra 2 button presses make it feel a bit more tedious. There are many ways in which the game shows off its jank. You cannot jump at all, there's no plunging attacks or fluidity to the feeling of combat, enemies literally cannot follow you beyond a certain point because they're not programmed to navigate certain parts of the map. There are areas where if you fall into them you won't die, but you can't move or do anything, so you have to hope an enemy will come along and kill you. You constantly feel slow and heavy regardless of what you have equipped. It's not a great feeling game. Even Demon Souls feels better to play on a moment-to-moment level, and I don't mean Demon Souls 2020 something. I forgot when the remake came out. I mean like the original one. The original one was clunky, but even it felt a bit better to play than this mess. Morbid has a lot of shortcomings, but if I think about them, none of them alone or even combined are enough to make the game annoying or unplayable. They all skirt that very fine line of being weird enough to draw my attention, but not so much that they destroy the game. Sadly, they drag the game down just enough that as an experience, Morbid doesn't rise above mediocre. I can remember the exact moments in many games where I realised that I am into this whole thing, where I'm actually enjoying myself, but Morbid hasn't had that yet, and I'm at the third area boss. That's anywhere between 3 to 6 hours of content depending on how you play, and I've not felt that click, that point where I'm now playing for fun rather than playing for a video. Now, to be fair, there are things I like. I like the level layouts. They're usually large enough to provide ample combat space, and are just maze-like enough to keep you on your toes as you explore. The design of a lot of the enemies is grotesque in a way that I utterly adore. I'm a big fan of body horror, and I love that a lot of the bosses and enemies I've seen really seem to be playing that up. Just look at this one. It's disgusting, and I love it. The hub level has really nice ambient music. The game includes alongside your primary healing items several smaller ones that can be found sparingly throughout the levels, which can keep your health ticking over until you find your next checkpoint, and I honestly don't even dislike that there is no shop or real economy. We're in a dying world, and we're its last hope, so the people around us tend to just give us useful things as often as they can because they want to survive, and certain tools, if we really want to use them, then we need to find them in the world, so we can't rely on them too much. I respect this quite a lot. It almost feels rewarding to play well and therefore not need to use the items, so you can save them for later when you might really need them. One item that you'll definitely want to stockpile though is the calming capsule, as the game features a madness mechanic. The more insane you're going, the less XP you'll get from kills, and if you're going too mad, then you see the enemies rise from the dead after you kill them, but this time they're a Spectre version that can't be staggered. Now, it doesn't take as many hits to kill the Spectre version, but it is still kind of annoying. If you have none of these capsules, then you just have to kind of avoid combat for a while because your meter will deplete naturally, or you can rest at a checkpoint to regain your clarity. I don't generally like madness systems, but I don't necessarily dislike this one. I mean, it does make some sense. If I was facing demonic horrors out of H.P. Lovecraft's wet dreams, then I'd probably lose my shit too. I do wish we had more ways to alleviate madness when it builds up, but the best strategy is avoidance. Avoid being hit too often in combat and you should be fine. I mean, I personally would argue that health loss plus expending healing items to get back said lost health is already punishment enough for being hit in combat, but the game was at least trying to do something. It was kind of a dumb idea that had as much business being in the game that a dick has being in a toaster, but it was an idea, though sadly I don't really give points for unique ideas just because they're unique. I'd argue my piss-powered washing machine was also a unique idea, but that doesn't mean it's worth anything. Look, the madness mechanic isn't the most terrible thing to ever be done in a game ever. It merely shares the same issue that most systems in Morbid do. It's just not very good. Not even the bad kind where I can laugh endlessly at its issues or even get particularly angry at it. It's almost a shame that the game is relatively competently made, because it now enters into a plane of existence where I have fuck all to say or remember about this entire experience. I made the mistake of stopping my recording process for a few days to get some stuff done, and I completely forgot I was working on this, like, entirely forgot. I reinstalled a different game and recorded all of the footage for that, and I was even planning out what I was going to say in that until I came onto Google Doc and realised, oh yeah, I was already doing a thing. That's just how little impact this game makes on my brain matter. I played Morbid for about 6 hours. I got to the third area, which is a big industrial complex place with these weird chain-linked fences, which for some reason I find weirdly distracting. I don't know why. I'm sure you'd expect to see a chain-linked fence in an industrial area, but there's just something about it. I don't know, for some reason I found it weirdly distracting. I'm not saying there is actually a problem with them, I just personally found them kind of distracting, and I thought I would tell you. Anyway, this whole area ends in a boss fight with a giant lady hooked up to these weird IV bags. The fight itself has a somewhat interesting gimmick. You can't reach her with your attacks, but she is slowly dying, and basically all you have to do is survive the environment and her minions to win. I actually quite like this gimmick. It's testing our endurance, our ability to hold up, but it does run up against being a discount bed of chaos situation as the arena is slowly falling away, which can instantly kill you, but at least the bed of chaos was in a good game. I know I'll have footage of this boss on the screen right now as I talk about her, but like every character in this game, I cannot remember off the top of my head any of their names. Nothing about it adheres to my memory. I admit I do have a poor memory at the best of times. I spent 3 hours the other day trying to remember where I put Mario Kart 8 before realising it was actually in my Switch. which. I spent several days trying to find a letter from my doctor before I remembered that they'd sent me an email. I suck with episodic memory, and some of the things that I'm the least likely to latch onto are the things that sit comfortably within mundanity. Lords of Ire never really finds that all-important groove. If you've played other Souls-likes, and I doubt you'd seriously struggle with it in any major way, the boss fights are easy to learn, and once you know that enemies have 2 or maybe 3 attacks apiece, you'll be fine. Plus, when you realise that most bosses are weak to being parried, you'll probably get through most of the encounters in one go. But again, that's not to say that there is nothing here that I like. The environments themselves aren't poorly designed. I actually quite like what I've seen for the most part. The second area, whose name starts with Dung, and that's literally the only part of the title I can remember, is actually an interesting labyrinth of tight roads and flooded streets, and it's got this really oppressive atmosphere that I adore, even though the name still feels stupid. The hub isn't bad, it looks good and has a nice little outdoor area, though the game does pull a bit of a dick move and puts an NPC on a rafter because reasons, though the music track that plays here is rather nice and adds to the ambiance. Music in the game is generally quite good, I think I like the music, though I can't really recall any tracks, they just weren't that memorable. The voice acting, it's alright. It's functional, I mean, it's a tiny bit cringe, I guess, but like nothing that bad. The combat feels, kind of fine, I guess, once you get over the fact that you feel a bit too slow. Like, I mean, it's passable. God, I really wanted to have a bit where I list off all the positive things I want to say about the game, but this really ain't working. It feels so weird coming from Crab Souls to Morbid Lords of Ire. It's like I just played a practically perfect Dark Souls-inspired game about an adorable crab, which comments on the impact that we have on our environment as people, the effects of unchecked capitalism that sustains itself through the unsustainable, and the idea of breaking away from normality, and now I'm playing a game where demons happened, and demons are kind of bastards, so kill them, I guess. But I say we save that for the story section. Let's wrap up my thoughts about the gameplay. Morbid looks and sounds nice enough, but mechanically it's nothing special. It's the most basic version of the Souls-like with virtually no identity of its own that feels more out of date than the Demon Souls remake did, but never quite reaches the point of being really good or really bad for that matter. It's a forgettable gameplay experience that, whilst it does try to spice things up, it does so in ways that only serve to further balance the experience out until it lands in the Valley of Meh, where the sky is always sort of cloudy and the locals are all sharing frozen yogurt. The gameplay isn't the epitome of shit, but when it all comes together, I find we're left with an aggressively mediocre experience. Like, it's doing its best to keep the needle right in the middle. It's not the worst video game ever made, but it is among the worst kinds of video game that can be made, the type that's low-key kinda boring. When I said the game could be boiled down to demons are bastards, go and kill them, I wasn't kidding. That is the basic premise of this game. We're killing demonic horrors to make the world less demonic and horrible. But since I actually want this section to reach a decent length so it doesn't seem like a huge afterthought, let's dive in and see what the narrative has to offer. You play as the Striver. Who is the Striver? Well, a sort of chosen hero who will vanquish the demons. Where does she come from? I don't know, the game never really says. It was while researching to try and piece together the narrative as effectively as I could, I discovered that Lords of Ire is in fact a sequel to a game called Morbid the Seven Acolytes, and the game assumes that you've played through the first one. I can't entirely fault it, it's a sequel, it probably expects that you've played the previous game, although I will say I do think video game sequels that can stand up on their own are much better. Based on what I've pieced together, your Striver is the last of a group of warriors trained from birth to do battle with the Seven Acolytes. The Acolytes being the big bosses of the areas, by the by, individuals possessed by beings known as the Gahar, which I've managed to conclude are sort of nightmare gods which are to blame for the demons that the world is currently facing. This being a Souls-like, much of the world building and story is hidden away in item descriptions and, in this game's case, enemy descriptions. You can read enemy descriptions at the checkpoints. I'm starting to tire of this approach because it feels more like a developer saying we couldn't be asked to actually do engaging storytelling, so we're just assigning you homework. But I'd like to make more of an effort, so I'll quickly fire up the game and read the item descriptions to piece everything together. While we're doing that, I'll leave you with footage from my favourite boss fight of the game so far. Not because it was a particularly entertaining thing to actually fight, I just like how it looks. So I just got done reading the lore that was available to me, and honestly, it's not bad. If leaning a little too hard onto the bleakness for bleakness' sake cliche of the subgenre, the items and menagerie all tell interesting stories of people being promised power, but in a way that really fucks with them, sort of like the old cursed monkeys poor thing. So as you can expect, it all comes with a hidden horrific cost, the Gahara basically ruining their bodies and their minds for what I can only assume is their own sick, twisted entertainment. It's not as if nightmare gods have a whole lot else motivating them. Again, a lot of this backstory sort of feels like this is a Souls-like, so we've got to be bleak, but I can't deny that the lore is competently written with some interesting happenings, so given the nature of the game and how we're expected to absorb all this information, I am left a little less enthralled than I otherwise would be. I don't know, the whole reading lore through write-em descriptions? What am I, Scooby-Doo? The whole reading lore through item descriptions thing is so overdone now that it feels very impersonal. Still though, I didn't dislike the lore or anything. I actually beat that big cyborg lady I said about during the gameplay section. Not that I was trying harder than before, I was just thinking, yeah, I might as well half-ass this whilst I'm here, and it just sort of worked. Her story is that she was once a bright and cheerful little lass who worked in a machine factory with her dad, but she was gruesomely wounded one day by a machine malfunction and it left her bitter and in constant pain. She reached out to the Gahar to ease her suffering, and yeah, that didn't work as intended. It does make the fight a bit sadder in retrospect, and we can take solace in the fact that she is now at peace. I do like grim stories, it does appeal to the pit of blackness within my soul, but the best part of all of this is that I unlocked Area 4, which is basically London during the Black Death, and I loathe this game for holding out on me because Bloodborne has the best atmosphere in the entire Soulsborne series, and this level is definitely channeling that. We awaken in an abandoned train station, and I love the look of these trains. It just, yes, I love this. The atmosphere, the grimness of it all. This is the best looking area so far. Then I died really easily to something I wasn't prepared for, and thought, yeah, that's fair. Then put the game down and went back to playing Dad of Boy, which I reinstalled. I don't know, if this had been like the second or maybe the first area, then I probably would have stuck it out, but I'm already kind of bored, and like every time I die, I'm not feeling that rush of, oh, I want to show this game what for. I'm just like, yeah, alright then. It just feels a bit too late to engage me right now is my point. Still though, the actual narrative isn't terrible. If a little cliche, it's a fairly interesting story of a world slowly decaying and the few sane folks remaining trying desperately to fend off the darkness, but again, it does feel a bit too bleak for its own good. Dark Souls was bleak, yes, but it was also encouraging and oddly hopeful. The fire might one day fade, but the embers would always remain, and maybe the world we create through the Age of Dark would be worse, but it could also be really good for mankind, and whilst most NPCs died as you proceeded, they still often felt like their last moments were spent where they wanted to be or doing what they wanted to do. Lords of Ire just feels depressing without any real shifting of the overall tone. Now I've gone on about that before, the importance of the tonal shift when telling a story, especially a video game, about whilst the general theme and overall atmosphere should remain relatively consistent, the moments throughout the journey need to have highs and lows to combat audience apathy. Now I love a good depressing story, I really do. One of my favourite songs is called My R, it's that song about the gamer ending of people's selves. I love the Jurassic Bark episode of Futurama or the My Lunch episode from Scrubs. I adore the narrative and setting of Dark Souls, and the entire Fallout New Vegas Dead Money DLC is just lovely. Don't get me wrong, it's bleak as all fuck, but it also has a weirdly uplifting ending depending on how you play it. You can absolutely do depressing stories, but if you maintain one tone throughout the entire experience, then we get used to it and eventually bored of it. Highs and lows, I cannot stress enough, are really important in storytelling. And so whilst the backstory isn't badly written and even has some interesting tidbits, it's hard to stay engaged with. The story might improve as we go, I don't know. I don't have another 4 to 6 hours to spare because I'm bored now, and every little inconvenience I run up against in this game makes me want to just shut it off and do something else rather than dealing with it. Morbid does have a fairly interesting story when you actually dig into it. It has some fairly compelling characters, both in terms of backstory and visual design. My favourite character in the game was that last boss we just fought. The idea of an innocent child being reduced to a ball of bitterness and agony is genuinely quite heartbreaking, especially when you know that she was working with her dad and loved doing it, then literally sold her soul to try and alleviate the pain she was now in. When we reach her, she's basically on her last legs, I don't think she even has legs anymore, desperately fending us off even as her body fails and falls apart. It's not a glorious fight between two warriors, it's a terminal patient whose life support is failing and all we can do is survive her feeble attempts to be rid of us. It's a good bit of story, really, hats off here. I didn't feel great about any of it, and I love when a game makes me feel not great about the things that I'm necessarily doing, but it doesn't save the game, it's just an unnecessarily good bit of backstory in an otherwise middle-of-the-shelf experience. Would have been a lot nicer if we learned most of this before the fight, but what can you do? The world of Lords of Ire is weird in a way that I can't fully explain. The first two areas are relatively dark fantasy in a generic enough way, but the next two areas are industrial, near modern I suppose in terms of tech development. But I guess this isn't really bad because it's fantasy and it can do whatever it wants. I just don't love it. It's not really a thing I can necessarily fault. Again, I just don't care for it personally. I know that I've said that a few times, that I just don't love it personally, and that's like the most boring criticism I could offer, but like that's just it. I don't have anything else to say. I just kind of don't like it in a way that's not really overly complex. It's just not for me. Although if there's any game that deserves boring criticism, it's probably this one. Overall though, Morbid is stronger in the story section than it was in the gameplay department, though the way we're told the story feels so impersonal and borderline lazy that what could have elevated the game to being quite good actually instead just keeps the game idling at meh quality. I don't like Morbid Lords of Ire. I don't hate Morbid Lords of Ire. I don't really anything Morbid Lords of Ire. It is smack bang in the middle of the very concept of quality, balancing out really well to make a very alright experience. I can't speak for how it stands as a sequel. I might have gotten more into it if I'd played game 1, but a good sequel to any piece of media should still be enjoyable enough on its own without needing to engage with the first, especially in video games. I should still be able to get something out of it. I bring this up sometimes, but in my first experience with Bioshock as a franchise, it was Bioshock 2 I played, and I loved Bioshock 2. It was really good and sold me on the franchise. Playing Bioshock 1 added some info, but I felt I got exactly what I needed to understand the proceedings thanks to the way the game was built and the way the story was told. Morbid Lords of Ire was really hard to write about because of its mediocrity. I did try to be as fair as possible, but when we get right down to it, all that Lords of Ire really is a bitch basic Souls-like which doesn't really light the medium on fire or even have the decency to be shit so I can get a laugh out of it. I guess if you played the first game then you might want to check it out to see where the story goes, but if you're just a random avid lover of Souls-likes like myself, then I say you're better served elsewhere. Like, just spitballing here, but maybe play a Souls-like about a crab who loses their shell and must traverse an ocean full of pollution and danger to retrieve what was theirs. You should play Another Crab's Treasure. Lords of Ire is the video game equivalent of the colour beige, and I think we've given it enough of our time. I don't recommend it, even though the developer is based here in the UK with me and might hunt me down so that they can lock me in a beige room and make me watch Family Guy Season 17 on repeat with the only snacks available being Lidl's own tortilla chips and Diet Dr. Pepper. Wow, what a fate worse than meh. That'll do us. I hope you enjoyed the video, my lovelies. Do let me know in the comments because the engagement helps the channel grow. Don't forget to like and subscribe and so forth. Oh, and go and play Another Crab's Treasure. It's good. It's really good. I will take whatever opportunity arises to suggest going and playing it. Anyway, that's all I've got for you, so take it easy, my loves. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you next time. Ta-ta. Play Another Crab's Treasure.